The wind didn't just blow across the moors surrounding Hawthorne Manor, it prowled. It carried the scent of approaching rain, ancient peat, and secrets that had been buried in the mud for a century. Alara Vance stood on the rotting wraparound porch, the iron key heavy and cold in her palm, letting the gale whip her waist-length hair around her face. At 51, she no longer fought the elements. She let the wind tangle the silver streaks in her raven hair, accepting the chaos as an old friend. "All right then, old girl," Alara whispered, her voice husky with the fatigue of a long journey and a longer life. "Let's see what bones you're hiding." She inserted the key. The lock resisted, grinding metal against rust, a stubborn refusal that vibrated up her arm. Hawthorne Manor had stood empty for 30 years, a Victorian monstrosity of turreted stone and weeping windows, perched directly atop one of the most potent ley line intersections in the county. To a developer, it was a money pit. To Alara, it was a battery. And God, did she need a recharge. With a sharp twist and a muttered word that tasted of copper and ash, the lock yielded. The heavy oak door groaned inward, exhaling a breath of stale air, mildew, and abandonment. Alara stepped across the threshold, her velvet boots silent on the dusty floorboards. The foyer was cavernous, swallowed by shadows that seemed to cling to the peeling wallpaper. A grand staircase swept upward into the gloom, its banister cracked like a broken spine. But beneath the decay, she felt it. A low, thrumming vibration that buzzed in the soles of her feet and made the fine hairs on her arms stand erect. The power here was immense, raw, and entirely unguarded. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She didn't smell the rot that a normal contractor would notice. She smelled potential. She smelled the sharp tang of ozone gathering in the corners and the earthy richness of dried sage she carried in the pockets of her linen coat. "I am Alara," she announced to the empty hall, her voice ringing with the authority of 3 decades of practice. "I claim this space. I claim this stone. I bring light to the dark and heat to the cold." The house did not answer. The silence was heavy, oppressive, like a hand clamped over a mouth. She moved deeper into the house, drawn by an invisible thread toward the great room. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, the mouth of the fireplace black with the soot of fires extinguished long ago. This was the heart of the home. If she was to wake the manor, she had to start here. Alara shrugged off her coat, revealing a flowing tunic the color of dried lavender. She approached the hearth, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with exertion. Her magic had been flickering lately. Sparks where there used to be flames, whispers where there used to be roars. Menopause, the doctor said. The changing of the tide, her grandmother had called it. But Alara feared the tide was going out and might never return. She knelt on the cold flagstones. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a handful of salt and crushed rosemary. With precise, practiced movements, she cast a circle on the floor, the crystals crunching softly. "Awaken," she commanded, placing both palms flat against the freezing stone of the mantel. Nothing happened. The stone remained inert, dead, and cold under her skin. Alara frowned, frustration tightening her jaw. She dug deeper, past the physical, reaching for the well of power that lived in her blood. She visualized the ley lines beneath the foundation, great rivers of white light, and pulled. "I said, awaken!" The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The stone didn't just warm, it scorched. A shockwave blasted through Alara's palms, throwing her backward. She landed hard on her hip, gasping as the air in the room was sucked into the fireplace with a terrifying whoosh. The shadows in the corners didn't retreat. They elongated, stretching like claws toward the center of the room. Above her, the crystal chandelier, caked in decades of grime, began to sway. Not from wind, the windows were shut tight, but from a tremor that shook the very foundation of the manor. The floorboards screamed, a high-pitched wooden shriek. "This isn't a recharge," Alara realized, scrambling backward, her eyes wide. "This is a rejection!" A heavy iron poker from the fireplace set flew across the room as if thrown by an invisible hand, smashing into the wall inches from her head. Plaster rained down into her hair. "Enough!" Alara shouted, raising a hand, her fingers splayed. She pushed her will against the rising pressure, a dam holding back a flood. "I am the mistress of this house! You will yield!" The house shuddered one last time, a sullen, grinding quake, and then the energy snapped. The chandelier ceased its swinging. The silence rushed back in, louder than the noise had been, but the air remained charged, electric and hostile. Alara slumped against the wall, chest heaving. She brushed the plaster from her shoulder, her hands trembling. It was stronger than she thought, and it was angry. Boom, boom, boom. The sound came from the front door, 3 rhythmic, heavy strikes that demanded attention. Not a supernatural manifestation. A fist. Alara froze. The adrenaline from the magical backlash collided with the sudden, jarring intrusion of the mundane world. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing her tunic and checking her reflection in a grime-streaked mirror. Her pupils were blown wide, her hair wilder than the wind had left it, and she looked like a woman who had just wrestled a demon, which, in a sense, she had. She hurried to the foyer, composing her face into a mask of polite confusion. When she hauled the heavy oak door open, the sight that greeted her made her breath hitch in a completely different way. Standing on the porch, framed by the weeping gray sky, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and bad days. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of a weathered leather jacket. Rain darkened his short, salt and pepper hair, plastering it against a forehead etched with lines of deep concentration. But it was his eyes that held her. Steel gray, sharp as a scalpel, and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept over her, taking in the velvet, the wild hair, the smudge of soot on her cheek, assessing her threat level in a microsecond. "Police," he rumbled. His voice was a baritone scrape of gravel over velvet resonating in her chest. He held up a badge, the metal gleaming dully in the twilight. "Detective Silas Thorne." Alara blinked, her hand gripping the edge of the door. The man radiated an aura so grounded, so fiercely aggressively human, that it almost made her dizzy. He smelled of rain, old tobacco, and the metallic tang of a gun cleaning kit. "Detective," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is there a problem?" "That depends," Silas said, lowering the badge, but not his gaze. He looked past her, into the dark maw of the foyer. "We got a report of a disturbance. Neighbors 3 miles down heard a crash that sounded like an explosion, and I saw lights flickering from the road." "Renovations," Alara lied smoothly, though her pulse was fluttering in her throat. "I'm the new owner. I dropped something heavy." Silas's eyes narrowed. He looked at her again, really looked at her. He saw a woman of 50, elegant despite the disarray, with eyes the color of deep moss that seemed to hold too much knowledge. He didn't buy it. Silas Thorne hadn't bought a simple explanation in 20 years on the force. "Something heavy," he repeated, his tone flat. "Sounded like the roof caved in, ma'am. I need to come in and check the structural integrity. Make sure you aren't bringing the place down on your own head." "That won't be necessary," Alara said quickly, stepping to block the entrance. The spirit inside was dormant, not gone. Bringing a skeptic like him across the threshold was a recipe for disaster. "I assure you, everything is under control." Silas stepped closer. The proximity was overwhelming. He was a wall of heat in the damp air. He looked down at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not mocking, but weary. The expression of a man who found the world perpetually disappointing. "Ms. Vance. Alara Vance." "Ms. Vance, I'm a homicide detective. I don't usually do noise complaints, but I was driving by and this place has a history, a bad one. So when I hear a boom, I check." He leaned one hand against the door frame, looming over her. "Now, either you let me take a look, or I call the fire department to condemn the building until an inspector comes out next month. Your choice." Alara tightened her jaw. Logic, bureaucracy, men with badges and broad chests who thought they could order the world into neat little boxes. He was infuriating. He was also devastatingly attractive in the moonlight. "Fine," she clipped out, stepping back. "But wipe your feet. The floor is original." Silas grunted and stepped inside. As he crossed the threshold, Alara felt a ripple in the air, a collision of energies. His skepticism was a shield, a dense barrier of rationality that actually dampened the ambient magic in the room. The buzzing in the floorboards quieted. The shadows seemed to retreat, afraid of his absolute belief in the tangible. "Place is a wreck," Silas noted, his boots thudding heavily as he walked toward the great room. He pulled a heavy flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting through the gloom. "It's a project," Alara corrected, following him. She watched his back, the way the leather jacket stretched across his shoulders. He moved with the prowling grace of a predator, distinct from the wind outside. He was dangerous, but disciplined. Silas stopped in the doorway of the great room. The beam of his flashlight played over the overturned chair, the smashed plaster on the floor, and the heavy iron poker lying 10 feet from the fireplace. He turned to her, one eyebrow raised. "You dropped a poker. From where?" the ceiling. I tripped, Alara said, crossing her arms. I have balance issues. Silas walked over to the poker. He crouched down, his knees cracking slightly, a human sound that made him strangely more appealing. He didn't touch the iron. He just studied the trajectory. Physics is a funny thing, Miss Vance, Silas said softly, standing up and turning to face her. The flashlight beam was pointed at the floor, casting his rugged face in sharp relief. The scar running through his left eyebrow shone white. To land here, this iron would have had to fly horizontally with significant force. Tripping doesn't do that. Are you accusing me of throwing it? Alara asked, lifting her chin. At whom? The ghosts? She meant it as a deflection, a joke to make him roll his eyes. Instead, the air in the room suddenly dropped 30 degrees. Alara's breath plumed in a white cloud before her face. Silas stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the holistic at his hip. Though he didn't draw the weapon, he looked around, eyes narrowing. Drafty, he muttered, though the tension in his shoulders said he knew it was more than a draft. We should go, Alara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The shadows were lengthening again, creeping toward Silas's boots. The spirit didn't like him. It didn't like his order, his skepticism, his sheer weight. Not yet, Silas said, stepping toward the hearth. I want to check the flue, if you've got a gas buildup. Silas! Don't! Alara reached out. He ignored her, leaning into the dark mouth of the fireplace, shining his light up the chimney. It's blocked. You light a fire in here, you'll kill yourself before morning. Behind him, the heavy velvet curtains on the far window began to rise, lifting slowly into the air as if pulled by invisible marionette strings. The air pressure in the room plummeted, popping Alara's ears. Silas straightened up, dusting soot from his hands. You need a professional, Ms. Vance. This isn't safe for a woman alone. I'm not alone, Alara whispered, the hairs on her neck standing up. Silas turned to look at her, confused by her tone. Excuse me. He didn't see it. He didn't see the black mass coalescing behind him, a vortex of rage and sorrow forming a towering shape. But he felt it. Alara saw the color drain from his face, saw the way his pupils dilated as the primitive part of his brain, the lizard brain that remembered when humans were prey, screamed at him to run. But Silas Thorne didn't run. He turned back toward the hearth, toward the threat, his hand finally closing around the grip of his gun. Who's there? He barked, his voice commanding, authoritative, addressing a monster like it was a perp. The entity roared, a sound not of air, but of grinding stone and shattering glass. The flashlight in Silas's hand flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, the heavy stone mantelpiece above Silas's head gave a sickening crack. It tilted forward, tons of granite detaching from the wall, aiming directly for the detective's skull. Alara didn't think. She didn't recite an incantation. She lunged. She threw herself at Silas, her body colliding with his hard, leather-clad frame. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but the momentum sent them both sprawling onto the flagstones, just as the mantelpiece crashed down behind them with the force of a meteor strike. Debris sprayed over them. Silas grunted, rolling instantly to cover her, shielding her body with his own. For a heartbeat, they lay there in the dark, tangled together on the freezing floor. His weight was heavy, crushing, and terrifiedly welcome. His cheek was pressed against hers, rough with stubble, and she could feel the frantic, hammering beat of his heart against her chest. Then the silence returned, absolute and suffocating. Silas lifted his head, his breath hot against her ear. Ms. Vance, he rasped, his voice shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and fury. What the hell is wrong with your house? Dear listeners, please leave a comment about which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel in the name of love. This will support me and give me inspiration for new stories. The dust settled in a slow, suffocating drift, coating the ancient Persian rug in a layer of gray silt. Silence reclaimed the foyer, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing. Silas pushed himself up on one arm, the worn leather of his jacket creaking in the gloom. He hovered over her for a moment longer than necessary, his steel-gray eyes searching hers, scanning for injury with the clinical precision of a man who had spent 3 decades assessing crime scenes. But there was nothing clinical about the heat radiating from him. It was a furnace blast against the cool, damp air of the manor, a grounded, masculine solidity that made Alara's senses reel. For a split second, the scent of him, rain-soaked pavement, old leather, and a sharp, spicy musk that was entirely his own, overpowered the perpetual aroma of dried sage that clung to her velvet robes. I asked you a question, Alara, Silas growled. the vibration of his chest rumbling against her ribs before he finally, reluctantly, rolled off her and stood up. He offered a hand, his palm calloused and broad. Alara stared at the hand. It was a weapon of logic, a tool of the mundane world. Yet as she placed her fingers in his, a spark, not magical, but purely biological, snapped up her arm. She allowed him to pull her to her feet, smoothing the crushed velvet of her midnight blue skirts with trembling hands. "Old houses have temperaments, detective," Alara said, her voice striving for a calm she didn't quite possess. She looked toward the decimated fireplace. The heavy oak mantel, which had withstood 2 centuries of storms, lay splintered on the flagstones. It hadn't just fallen, it had been thrown. She could still feel the residual hum of the house's energy, a petulant spike of jealousy because she had invited a strange man into its heart. Silas clicked on a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, the beam cutting through the swirling dust motes like a lightsaber. He swept the light over the wreckage, his jaw tight. "Temperaments don't defy the laws of physics," he muttered, crouching to inspect the jagged edge of the wood. "The mortar is crumbled, yes, but the angle of this debris, it looks like it exploded outward." He stood, fixing her with that piercing, skeptical gaze that made her want to simultaneously hide and confess sins she hadn't committed. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you had a gas leak. Or a bomb." "Don't be dramatic, Silas. It's dry rot and gravity," Alara lied smoothly, though she knew he wasn't buying it. She moved toward the kitchen, needing to put distance between herself and his intense scrutiny. "I'll put the kettle on. Shock requires tea with valerian root." "No tea," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, brooking no argument. He stepped into her path, blocking the hallway. He was a wall of weathered authority. "And no staying here tonight until I've inspected the rest of this structural nightmare. If the mantelpiece can decide to commit suicide, I need to know the stairs aren't going to collapse under you." Alara looked up at him. At 54, Silas Thorne was a masterpiece of harsh lines and silvered edges. The fluorescent beam of his flashlight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the worry lines etched around his eyes and the stubborn set of his mouth. He was trying to protect her. The realization softened the defensive spell she had been mentally weaving. "You want to inspect Hawthorne Manor?" she asked, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "At midnight? I want to make sure you don't die in your sleep because a ceiling beam decides to give up the ghost," he countered. "Lead the way. We start with the upper landing." Alara sighed, the sound like wind moving through dry leaves. "Very well, detective, but mind your step. The house doesn't take kindly to critics." They moved toward the grand staircase. The electricity was still out in the main hall, leaving them in a cavernous world of shadows and flashlight beams. As they walked, Alara extended her senses, whispering a silent plea to the spirits of the manor to behave. She could feel them watching from the cornices, curious, restless, whispering in a frequency that only made the hair on her arm stand up. To Silas, it was just a drafty old building. To her, it was a choir of memories. They began the ascent. The staircase was a sweeping curve of mahogany, dusty and groaning under their weight. Silas walked behind her, his heavy boots making a solid thud, thud, thud that seemed to echo in the hollows of the house. Alara felt the shift in the air halfway up. It wasn't the house. It was him. She paused, her hand gripping the banister. Without the distraction of the crash, her empathic barriers were lower than usual. She felt a wave of cold wash over her back. Not the chill of a ghost, but the frigid, desolate temperature of old grief. It radiated from Silas like a winter fog. She turned slowly on the stair, looking down at him. He was 3 steps below, the flashlight held low, illuminating his leather jacket and the gun holster he wore out of habit, even off duty. He wasn't looking at the stairs. He was staring into the dark void of the upper hallway, his eyes unfocused. "Who was she?" Alara asked softly. The question bypassed her filter, pulled from her by the sheer weight of his sadness. Silas blinked, the steel shutters slamming back down over his gaze instantly. "Who was who?" "The coldness you carry," Alara said, stepping down 1 tread so she was closer to his level. She could smell the ozone on him now, the scent of storm clouds gathering. "It's heavy tonight, Silas. Heavier than the dust in this house." Silas stiffened, his knuckles whitening on the flashlight. "I don't talk about cases, Ms. Vance, especially not cold ones." "I didn't ask about a case. I asked about the ghost you carry in your heart." He laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "I deal in facts. Evidence. Bodies I can touch and killers I can handcuff. I don't have time for ghosts. Don't you? Alara reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his chest. She didn't touch him, but she could feel the jagged tear in his aura. A child, a promise broken, the guilt of a protector who failed. You are a man of logic, Silas, but you are drowning in emotion. It's why you hate this house. It reminds you that some things linger, no matter how much you try to bury them. Silas looked at her hand, then up to her face. For a moment, the detective vanished, leaving just a man, tired, lonely, and bewildered by the woman standing above him. He saw the silver streaks in her hair shimmering in the peripheral light, the unearthly smoothness of her skin, the depth of her emerald eyes that seemed to see right through his badge and his cynicism. You're imagining things, he said, his voice gruff, though he didn't step away. It's just a draft. If you say so. Alara lowered her hand, sensing his boundaries snapping into place like tripwires. She turned back to the ascent. Come. The structural integrity won't verify itself. She took a step upward, her mind still distracted by the sorrow radiating from him. She didn't notice the warped board on the landing, the one the house usually guided her around. Her velvet slipper caught the lip of the wood. She pitched forward. It happened in a blur of motion. Alara gasped as gravity claimed her, bracing for the impact of the hardwood against her knees. But the impact never came. An arm like an iron band hooked around her waist, wrenching her back with shocking force. Silas had moved with the explosive speed of a man who had spent a lifetime reacting to sudden danger. He hauled her upright, spinning her around so her back pressed against the wall, his body caging her in. Got you, he breathed, the words harsh and reactive. They froze there on the landing. His hands were gripping her upper arms, his fingers digging into the velvet of her dress. He was close, too close. His legs were braced between hers, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. But it wasn't the rescue that stopped the breath in Alara's throat. It was the contact. Where his skin touched hers, even through layers of fabric, there was a reaction that defied all logic. It wasn't just warmth, it was a circuit closing. Silas was so grounded, so painfully human, that his energy acted like a lightning rod for her magic. She felt her power surge, rising up from the earth beneath the foundation, channeling through her spine and seeking him. Silas froze, his eyes widening. He felt it too. He had to. It was a static charge so potent it made the hair on his arms lift. He looked down at her, his skepticism warring with the undeniable sensation of pins and needles rushing through his nervous system. Alara, he whispered, and the sound of her name on his lips was gritty, intimate. Silas, let go, she warned, her voice trembling. The energy, it's too much. He didn't let go. Instead, his gaze dropped to her mouth. The air around them began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the crystals on the nearby wall sconce. The scent of ozone flared violently, smelling of a thunderstorm about to break directly overhead. You're burning up, Silas murmured, shifting one hand from her arm to cup her cheek. He was checking for fever, or perhaps he was just drawn to the fire. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, rough skin against porcelain. Crack! The single light bulb in the hallway, sconce above them, didn't just burn out. It exploded. Glass rained down, tinkling against the floorboards like hail. The flashlight Silas had been holding flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The batteries drained in a millisecond by the electromagnetic surge. Total, absolute darkness swallowed them. Alara gasped, the sudden dark disorienting her. She could feel the wild, chaotic magic swirling around them, confused by the mixture of her arousal and his intense, rigid focus. Stay still, Silas commanded from the dark, but his voice lacked its usual command. It was thick, ragged. He hadn't moved away. If anything, he was closer. She could feel the heat of his body acting as a beacon in the blackness. His hand was still on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in the dark, as if trying to read her face like Braille. Silas, she breathed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The bulb. Forget the bulb, he rasped, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath ghosting over her lips, smelling of coffee and mint. Tell me why, every time I touch you, it feels like I've grabbed a live wire. Alara reached out in the dark, her hands finding the lapels of his leather jacket. She needed to push him away, to explain that her magic was volatile, that he was too grounded for a woman who danced with moonbeams. But her hands didn't push. They clutched the leather, pulling him imperceptibly closer. Because, she whispered into the dark, the truth slipping out before she could catch it. "You are the only thing real enough to ground me." The silence stretched, heavy and electric. She waited for him to pull back, to make a joke, to revert to the detective who needed facts. But Silas Thorne didn't retreat. In the pitch black, his hand slid from her jaw to the nape of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair, heavy and possessive. He tilted her head back, and Alara realized with a jolt of terrifying thrill that he wasn't looking for the exit. "Then ground yourself," he growled and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss tasted of rain and ruin, a collision of worlds that should never have touched. It wasn't the tentative, fumbling exploration of youth. It was the heavy, inevitable crash of a wave against a cliff face. Silas's mouth was firm, demanding not submission, but presence. He tasted of black coffee and the expensive, earthy tobacco he didn't smoke, but that seemed to cling to his jacket, a scent that cut through the cloying sweetness of the lavender sachets Alara kept in her pockets. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, Alara forgot the scratching in the walls. She forgot the spectral cold that had been seeping down from the third-floor landing, the magic that constantly hummed beneath her skin, a restless current of ozone and static, suddenly quieted. It was terrified of him. Or perhaps it was simply awed by the sheer density of his humanity. He was solid, immovable, real. Then the house groaned, a low, vibrating timber moan that shuddered through the floorboards beneath their feet. The temperature in the foyer plummeted, turning the moisture of their breath into sudden, stark mist. Reality rushed back in with the violence of a breaking window. Alara gasped, her hands turning from clutching claws into palms that shoved hard against his chest. "Stop," she breathed, the word fracturing the silence. Silas didn't stumble back. He simply ceased, his body absorbing the force of her push without yielding ground. He stepped back slowly, his hands lingering on her arms for a second longer than necessary before dropping to his sides. In the dim light filtering through the fanlight window, his steel-gray eyes were blown wide, dark pupils swallowing the iris, hunting for answers. "That didn't feel like a stop a moment ago, Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble of gravel and velvet. Alara wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization of how easily she had almost surrendered control. The entity upstairs, the shadow that had been pacing the nursery, fed on emotion, and she had just served it a banquet of raw, unbridled desire. "It's late, Detective," she said, her voice trembling as she fought to erect her mental shields. She visualized a wall of briars, thick and impenetrable, rising between them. "You need to leave. The storm is getting worse." Silas glanced upward, his gaze tracking the intricate, cobweb-draped molding of the ceiling. He wasn't looking at the spirits. He was looking at the water stains spreading near the chandelier. The skepticism radiated off him like heat from a wood stove. "The storm isn't the problem," Silas countered, his tone shifting from lover back to lawman. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the dangerous sag of the main staircase. "This place is the problem. It's falling down around your ears, Alara, and you're here alone." "I am rarely alone," she murmured, the double meaning lost on him. Silas stepped closer, invading her personal space again, but this time without the seductive intent. This was protective aggression. "I felt that floor shift. I saw the wiring spark in the kitchen earlier. You think you can renovate this beast by yourself? You're going to get hurt. Or worse." Alara turned away, walking toward the grand fireplace where a bed of sage embers still glowed faintly orange. She needed to smudge the room the moment he left. The air felt thick, gelatinous with unseen eyes. "I have contractors coming next month. I can manage until then." "Next month?" Silas scoffed. He walked to the wall, running a calloused hand over the wainscoting. He found a loose panel, pressed it, and frowned as it gave way with a wet crunch of dry rot. "The structure won't wait a month, and neither will the investigation." Alara froze. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows against her silver-streaked hair. "What investigation?" Silas sighed, a sound of heavy weariness. He leaned against the newel post, looking every bit the weary warrior. 30 years ago, a girl went missing in this county. The trail went cold, frozen solid. But before she vanished, she sent a letter, postmarked from Hawthorne Manor. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ghost. "You think she's here?" "I think the answers are," Silas corrected. "This place was a boarding house then. The records, the guest logs, the old financial papers. They're all rotting in this house somewhere. I need to find them before the roof caves in and buries the truth forever. She studied him. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the white scar that bisected his left eyebrow. He wasn't a man chasing ghosts. He was chasing justice. It was a noble pursuit, one that resonated with her own duty to the dead. But his presence here was dangerous. His skepticism acted like an anchor, but anchors could drag you down just as easily as they held you steady. I can't have you here, Silas, she said softly. It's complicated. Because you're a witch? Alara's head snapped up. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Silas's lips quirked in a dry, humorless smile. I saw the dried herbs in the pantry, the crystals on the windowsills, the salt lines at the doors. I'm a detective, Alara. I notice details. I don't believe in magic, but I know you do. People have their rituals, coping mechanisms. I respect that. He didn't believe. He thought she was eccentric. A crazy cat lady with better fashion sense and a crumbling mansion. The relief was so profound it nearly made her dizzy. You think it's a coping mechanism, she repeated, testing the waters. I think living alone in a place like this does things to the mind, he said gently, though the words were patronizing. And I think you need help with the physical reality of this house, not just the spiritual one. He pushed off the newel post and walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the leather of his jacket again. It was intoxicating. A trade? Silas proposed. His voice dropped an octave. I'm not just a badge, Alara. My father was a master carpenter. I spent my summers hanging drywall and framing roofs before I ever picked up a gun. I can shore up that staircase. I can fix the wiring in the kitchen so you don't burn to death in your sleep. I can make this place safe. Alara looked at his hands. They were large, square-palmed, scarred from years of work. Hands that could build, hands that could destroy, hands that had tangled in her hair only minutes ago with a possession that made her knees weak. And in exchange, she asked? Access, he said. I want free reign of the archives, the library, the basement, the old office, wherever the papers are kept. I work on the house on weekends and evenings. You let me dig through the history. It was a dangerous bargain. To let a skeptic into the heart of Hawthorne Manor was asking for trouble. But as another draft swept through the hall, blowing out the single candle on the console table, Alara knew she was outmatched. The entity upstairs was ancient. She needed to focus her energy on binding it, not on fixing floorboards. If Silas handled the mortar and brick, she could handle the spirit and bone. There are conditions, she said, her voice turning crisp, the tone of a high priestess laying down the law of the circle. Silas crossed his arms. Name them. You work only when I am present in the house. You do not touch the salt lines. And there is one room that is forbidden. Silas raised an eyebrow. Bluebeard's closet? The attic, Alara said, her eyes flashing emerald fire in the dark. It is structurally unsound, and it is my personal sanctuary. You do not go up there, ever, under any circumstances. If you cross the threshold of the attic, the deal is void and you leave immediately. Do you understand? The attic was where she kept the scrying mirror, where the ley lines intersected, where the veil was thinnest. If a man like Silas, so rigidly grounded in the mundane, stepped into that vortex, the backlash could shatter his mind. Silas studied her face, searching for the lie. Finding none, he nodded slowly. The attic is off limits. Fine. I'm interested in the office records, not your meditation room. He extended his hand. Do we have an accord, Alara? Alara looked at his outstretched hand. In her world, a handshake was never just a handshake. It was a binding, a seal. To touch him was to invite his energy to mingle with hers, to tie his fate to the manor's. But I need him, the treacherous thought whispered. She reached out. Her hand, pale and slender, slipped into his rough, warm grip. We have an accord, Silas. They shook, and the moment their skin touched, the air in the foyer snapped. It wasn't a sound Silas would hear. It was a psychic boom, like a thunderclap in a cathedral. Alara felt a rush of power surge from him, steady, warm, fiercely protective, and crash into her own cool lunar magic. The connection was so intense she nearly gasped. It felt like a lock clicking into place. Silas frowned, looking down at their joined hands. He flexed his fingers as if he had felt a static shock. You have a lot of static electricity in this house, he muttered, pulling his hand back. Though he did it slowly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles as he retreated. Old carpets, Alara lied breathlessly. Her heart was racing. She had just bound a skeptic to a haunted house. What had she done? I'll start Saturday morning, Silas said. He moved toward the heavy oak door, his boots echoing on the marble. He paused with his hand on the brass latch, looking back at her. The shadows clung to him, seeming to shy away from his rugged form. Lock this behind me, Alara, and get that wiring checked. I don't like leaving you here in the dark. I am never in the dark, detective. I have the moon. He gave a short, rough chuckle, shook his head, and stepped out into the pouring rain. Alara rushed to the door, throwing the deadbolt and leaning her forehead against the cold wood. She listened to the crunch of his boots on the gravel, then the roar of his engine as he drove away. Silence reclaimed the manor. Heavy, oppressive, waiting. She turned around, intending to head to the kitchen for salt. Crack! The sound came from directly above her head. The crystal chandelier, heavy with 50 years of dust and glass, swung violently, though there was no breeze. And then, a whisper. Not inside her head, but audible, raspy, and dry as dead leaves skittering on pavement. It came from the top of the stairs, drifting down into the foyer where the warmth of Silas's body still lingered. He tastes delicious. Alara's blood ran cold. She looked up into the darkness of the second-floor landing. 2 pinpricks of yellow light blinked into existence in the shadows, staring down at her with ancient, malevolent hunger. She hadn't just grounded herself with Silas. She had brought a feast to the starving. The sky ripped open before Alara could even process the threat whispering from the landing. Thunder shook the very foundations of Hawthorne Manor, a guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards and up through the soles of her velvet slippers. It was a violent, unnatural sound, syncing perfectly with the malevolence pulsing from the top of the stairs. Then lights swept across the front windows. The heavy oak front door groaned open, admitting a gust of wind that smelled of wet asphalt and ozone, followed by a drenched figure. Silas Thorne stood on the threshold, water streaming from his leather jacket, his salt and pepper hair plastered to his forehead. He looked less like a detective and more like a force of nature that had decided to challenge the storm and lost. "Tree down," he grunted, slamming the door against the gale with a shoulder encased in wet leather. He locked it, the metal bolt sliding home with a definitive thud. Blocked the drive about 50 yards down. "I'm not getting out and no one is getting in." Alara exhaled, the breath leaving her lungs in a shaky rush. Part of her was relieved. She wasn't alone with the thing upstairs. The other part of her terrified. She had just trapped a skeptic in a cage with a hungry beast. "You're soaking," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She moved toward him, the hem of her linen skirt sweeping the dust-moated floor. "Come to the library. The chimney draws well there. I'll find you something dry." Silas wiped water from his eyes, his gaze sharp despite the weather beating he'd taken. He looked past her, toward the darkened staircase. "I thought I heard something. A crash?" "Old house is settled, detective," Alara lied smoothly, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. He would think she was hysterical, a menopausal woman seeing boogeymen in the shadows. "The wind is brutal tonight." He narrowed those steel-gray eyes, the eyes of a man who dissected lies for a living, but he nodded. "Right. Lead the way." The library was the heart of the manor, a high-ceilinged room lined with empty bookshelves that smelled of cedar and thyme. Alara busied herself with the fireplace, stacking kindling with trembling hands. She needed the fire, not just for warmth, but for the element itself. Fire cleansed, fire protected. Behind her she heard the heavy, wet slap of Silas's jacket hitting a chair. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier, denser. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a second. Bang! The library door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Silas spun around, hand instinctively going to the holster at his hip before he remembered he was off duty. "Drafts," he muttered, though his jaw was set tight. "This place is a wind tunnel, Alara. You need to check the weather stripping." "It's not the weather stripping, Silas," she murmured, striking a match. The flame flared to life, illuminating the worry lines etched around her mouth. She stood, brushing soot from her hands. "But let's pretend it is for now." She poured 2 generous measures of brandy into crystal snifters she had salvaged from the kitchen earlier. The amber liquid swirled, catching the firelight. When she turned, Silas was standing by the hearth, shivering slightly. He had stripped down to a charcoal t-shirt that clung to a chest built by years of physical labor and takedowns. The sight of him solid, scarred, undeniably real, anchored her. She handed him the glass. Their fingers brushed. A spark, static and hot, jumped between them. Silas didn't pull away. He held her gaze, the gray of his irises warming as they tracked over her face. "You're trembling," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its professional edge. "Are you cold?" "No," she whispered. "Just aware." He took a sip of the brandy, the harsh lines of his face softening as the alcohol hit his blood. "Aware of what? The storm? The structural issues?" He gestured vaguely at the ceiling with his glass. "I know it's a lot to take on. A renovation of this size, alone." "I'm not alone," she said, the double meaning hanging in the air like smoke. She took a sip of her own drink, the burn grounding her. "And neither are you tonight." Silas stepped closer to the fire, turning his back to the flames to warm himself. The firelight danced over his features, highlighting the silver at his temples. He was a handsome man, but not in the polished, plastic way of the world. He was handsome, like a cliff face or an old oak, weathered, enduring. "I don't mind the storm," Silas said, looking at the closed door. "It forces the world to stop. In my line of work, the world never stops. There's always another body, another call." "You carry the dead with you," Alara observed softly. She could smell it on him, beneath the rain and the leather, the heavy, metallic scent of sorrow. "It's a heavy cloak to wear." Silas looked at her sharply. "And what do you wear, Alara? You smell like a garden, but your eyes look like they've seen things that would make a beat cop retire early." "I deal in different kinds of shadows," she replied, moving closer to the warmth of the fire and to him. "The things people leave behind, echoes, intentions." Another thud came from the hallway, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps dragging across the floorboards above them. Heavy, deliberate. Silas tensed, his body shifting into a predator's stance. "There's someone up there. I checked the perimeter, but if a squatter got in before the storm..." "Silas, stop." Alara reached out, placing a hand on his forearm. His skin was warm, the muscle beneath it hard as iron. "There is no squatter. No living one, at least." He looked down at her hand, then up to her face. His expression was a warring mix of skepticism and a dawning, uneasy realization. "Don't start with the ghost stories, Alara, not tonight. I need logic, I need facts." "The fact is," she said, her voice low and fierce, "that this house is angry, and it doesn't like that you're here. Or perhaps it likes it too much." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "It likes me." "You are vibrant," she said, her thumb unconsciously tracing the tendon in his arm. "You are full of life force, determination, heat. To something cold and empty, you are a bonfire in winter." Silas didn't move away. The air between them thickened, no longer charged with fear, but with something far more ancient. The storm battered the windows, rain lashing against the glass in sheets, isolating them in this bubble of firelight and cedar. "And you?" he asked, his voice rough. He set his glass on the mantelpiece and turned fully toward her. "What am I to you?" Alara looked up at him. She was 51 years old. She had loved, she had lost. She had buried secrets and birthed power. She didn't have time for games. "You are the ground," she confessed. "I spend so much time with my head in the ether, listening to whispers. You are gravity." Silas's eyes darkened. The skepticism vanished, replaced by a raw, hungry intensity that mirrored the storm outside. He reached out, his calloused fingers grazing her jawline, tilting her face up to his. The touch was electric, sending a shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold spots in the room. "Alara," he murmured. It was a question and a claim all at once. She leaned into his touch. The scent of him, rain, expensive brandy, and warm, masculine skin filling her senses. It was intoxicating. For a moment, the ghost upstairs didn't exist. The rattling windows didn't exist. There was only the heat of his body radiating toward hers, the promise of a shelter she hadn't realized she needed. "Silas," she breathed. He lowered his head. His movements were slow, giving her every chance to back away, but she stayed rooted. She wanted this. She wanted the friction of his stubble against her skin, the weight of his reality pressing against her magic. Their breath mingled, warm and intimate. His hand slid into the hair at the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the silver-streaked raven waves. His grip was firm, possessive. "I don't believe in magic," he whispered against her lips, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "You will," she promised softly. He closed the distance. His lips were inches from hers, the anticipation of physical ache in the center of her chest. Screech. The sound was deafening, metal tearing through plaster. It came from directly above them. Silas's instincts, honed by 30 years on the force, took over before Alara could even draw a breath. He didn't look up. He launched himself at her, his arms wrapped around her waist, tackling her sideways. They hit the Persian rug with a bone-jarring impact, Silas twisting his body in midair to ensure he took the brunt of the fall, shielding her beneath him. Crash! The world exploded into crystal shards and dust. The floor shook as the massive iron chandelier, which had hung in the center of the library for a century, decimated the spot where they had been standing seconds ago. Glass flew like shrapnel, pinging off the leather of Silas's jacket and skittering across the floorboards. Silence followed, ringing and absolute. Alara lay pinned beneath Silas, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his chest. She could feel his heavy, rapid breathing, the tension in every muscle of his body. He was a heavy weight, warm and solid, covering her completely. Slowly, Silas lifted his head. There was a cut on his cheekbone, where a shard of flying crystal had grazed him, a single drop of blood welling up dark against his skin. He looked over his shoulder at the twisted wreckage of metal and glass, then looked back down at her. The skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a stark, terrifying clarity. He looked at the heavy iron hook that had been ripped, not fallen, but ripped from the ceiling beam. "That wasn't a draft," he rasped, his voice shaking with the adrenaline dump. "And that wasn't gravity." Alara stared past him, up toward the gaping hole in the plaster ceiling. The darkness up there seemed to swirl, satisfied and resentful all at once. "No," she whispered, reaching up to wipe the blood from his cheek, her fingers trembling. "It was a warning." Silas pushed himself up on his elbows, but he didn't let her go. He looked at the destruction, then at the woman beneath him, and for the first time, Alara saw true fear in the detective's eyes, not for himself. "We can't stay in this room," he said, his voice hard. "Can we?" Before she could answer, the fire in the hearth, which had been roaring only moments ago, hissed and died instantly, as if smothered by a giant, invisible hand. The library plunged into pitch blackness, and from the corner of the room, in the sudden, suffocating dark, the sound of slow, mocking applause began. The applause was dry, rhythmic, and coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't the sound of flesh striking flesh. It was the sound of dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. Silas scrambled to his feet, hauling Alara up with a grip that bruised. His other hand went instinctively to the holster beneath his arm, drawing his service weapon. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the library, the harsh LED light cutting through the swirling dust, but there was nothing there, just the ruins of the renovation and the oppressive weight of the dark. "Who's there?" Silas roared, his detective's voice booming, designed to assert dominance. "Identify yourself!" The only answer was a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath their boots. The temperature plummeted, turning the moisture in the air to instant frost. "Don't engage it, Silas!" Alara hissed, grabbing the lapel of his leather jacket. Her emerald eyes were wide, not with panic, but with a fierce, calculating intensity. "Your gun is useless here. We need to move. Now." She didn't wait for his agreement. She pulled him toward the heavy oak doors, and for a split second, Silas hesitated, the instinct to stand his ground warring with the primal urge to flee a predator he couldn't see. But the air around them was thickening, smelling of rot and stagnant water, choking the oxygen from his lungs. He holstered the weapon and followed her. They burst out into the hallway, the air instantly lighter, though the shadows still clung to the corners of the ceiling like spiderwebs. Alara didn't stop until they reached the second-floor landing, throwing open the door to her private suite at the end of the hall. She shoved him inside and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt. But she didn't stop there. Silas watched, chest heaving, as she pressed her palm flat against the wood, muttering something under her breath that sounded like wind rushing through dry wheat. A subtle shimmer, like heat haze, rippled across the doorframe before vanishing. "Safe," she breathed, leaning her forehead against the wood. "The wards hold here. It's my sanctuary." Silas stood in the center of the room, adrenaline still flooding his system, making his hands shake. He felt like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. He looked at Alara, at the wild tangle of her silver-streaked raven hair, the way her linen blouse had slipped off one shoulder, exposing pale, luminous skin. She smelled of the storm outside and the sage she burned inside, a scent that was rapidly becoming the only anchor he had left. "Alara," he rasped. "What the hell is happening in this house?" She turned, her back to the door. The moonlight filtering through the bay window caught the emerald fire in her eyes. She looked ancient and ageless all at once, a queen in a tower besieged by monsters. "Later," she whispered. She crossed the room toward him, her movements fluid like water seeking its level. She reached up, her thumb brushing the cut on his cheekbone where debris had struck him earlier. "You're bleeding!" The touch was electric. It grounded the terror and ignited something else entirely, something volatile that had been simmering between them since the day he'd arrived to investigate the accidents at the manor. Silas caught her wrist. His hand was large, rough-skinned, calloused from years of holding cold steel and cold cases. "I don't care about the blood," he said, his voice dropping an octave, rough with a hunger he hadn't realized he was suppressing. "I thought, when that ceiling came down—" "I know," she said softly. "I felt it too." The gap between them vanished. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was a collision. Silas buried his hands in her hair, pulling her mouth to his, devouring her sigh. He tasted of coffee and copper. She tasted of crushed lavender and secrets. The fear of death is a potent aphrodisiac, and they were both drunk on it. There was a desperate need to affirm life, to feel heat and pulse, and breath to counter the cold void they had just escaped. Alara made a low sound in her throat, pressing her body flush against his, her curves fitting against his hardness as if they had been carved from the same stone eons ago. He walked her backward until her legs hit the edge of the four-poster bed. They tumbled onto the duvet, a tangle of limbs and urgency. The moonlight bathed the room in silver, turning the scene into a chiaroscuro painting of shadows and sheets. "Alara," he groaned against her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin. He stripped off his jacket, tossing it heedlessly onto the floor, his badge glinting in the dark. Profound, terrifying beauty. She pulled his shirt open, her palms flattening against the scarred expanse of his chest, feeling the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart. It beat strong and steady, a drum of the living. "Silas," she whispered, her voice laced with a power that made his skin prickle. "You are so solid." There was no room for hesitation, no space for the insecurities of age. At 51, Alara knew her body was a map of her journey, softer in places, marked by time, but she felt no shame under Silas's worshipping gaze. And Silas, 54 years of cynicism etched into the lines around his eyes, felt his defenses crumble. He wasn't the detective here. He was just a man, stripping away the armor to find the warmth beneath. Their loving was a slow burn that ignited into a blaze. It was the friction of earth and sky. Silas moved with a deliberate, rugged intensity, his hands possessive, exploring every inch of her as if looking for evidence of salvation. Alara met him with the fluidity of the tides, wrapping herself around him, anchoring him to the mattress, to the moment, to her. It was messy and elegant, frantic and slow. When the crest finally came, it left them both shattered and breathless, clinging to each other in the tangled linens while the rain began to lash against the window pane, weeping for the night. Quiet settled over the room, heavy and sweet. Silas lay on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, the other draped protectively over Alara, who rested her head on his chest. He could feel the rise and fall of her breath, the flutter of her eyelashes against his skin. For the first time in years, the noise in his head, the victims, the cases, the cold logic, was silent. "I should check the perimeter," he murmured, though he made no move to rise. "Whatever was in the library." "Let it be for a moment," Alara said, her voice drowsy and thick. She traced a finger down the line of sternum. "The house is confused. It's angry, but it's holding." Silas shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look at her. His gray hair was mussed, his face softened by the afterglow. "You talk about this place like it's a person, Alara. Like it has moods." Alara opened her eyes, that piercing emerald gaze sobering. "Some places do, Silas. You know that. You've walked into crime scenes where the walls seem to scream." He frowned, the skeptic in him reaching for a foothold. "That's projection. Psychology. Bad things happen, and we project our horror onto the environment." "Is it?" She sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her silver-streaked hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of moonlight. Or is that just what you tell yourself so you can sleep at night? Before Silas could answer, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a draft this time, it was a vacuum. The sound of the rain outside ceased abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that drilled into their skulls. The heavy velvet curtains at the bay window blew inward, horizontal, though the window was closed. "Alara," Silas said, his voice tight. He sat up, reaching for his pants, his instincts screaming threat. Crack! The mirror above the vanity shattered, shards of glass exploding outward like shrapnel. Silas threw his body over Alara, shielding her as glass rained down on the bedspread. "It found us!" Alara gasped, struggling beneath his weight. "The wards! It broke the wards!" The room began to shake. The heavy armoire groaned and tipped forward. Silas rolled them both off the bed just as the heavy wood crashed onto the mattress where they had been lying seconds before. They hit the floor hard. Silas scrambled up, naked and vulnerable, scanning for a target, for anything he could fight. But the enemy was the air itself. A vortex of black smoke began to coalesce in the center of the room, darker than the night, smelling of sulfur and wet grave earth. It swirled violently, forming a vague, hulking shape with hollowed-out eyes. "Get out!" Silas roared, placing himself between Alara and the entity. He looked ridiculous and heroic all at once, a naked man trying to fistfight a nightmare. "Alara, get the door!" The entity laughed, the same mocking sound from the library, and lashed out with a tendril of smoke. It struck Silas in the chest with the force of a sledgehammer, throwing him backward against the wall. He crumpled, gasping for air, stunned. "No!" Alara screamed. She didn't run for the door. She didn't reach for her clothes. Alara Vance stood up. She let the sheet fall from her body, standing completely bare in the center of the chaos. She didn't look vulnerable. She looked terrifying. She planted her feet wide, feeling the ley lines running deep beneath the manor's foundation. She raised both hands, palms facing the swirling darkness. Her eyes were no longer just emerald. They were glowing with an internal, violet luminosity. "A bite!" Her voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, layered, echoing as if 100 women were speaking through her throat. "Exiab hac domo, ego te expello." Silas, fighting to drag air into his bruised lungs, looked up. He froze. The air around Alara crackled. Arcs of violet electricity sparked from her fingertips, smelling of ozone and burning cedar. The shadows in the room recoiled from her light. She wasn't praying. She was commanding. "Vede retro!" she shrieked, thrusting her hands forward. A blast of pure concussive force erupted from her palms. It hit the black smoke with a thunderclap that rattled Silas's teeth. The entity shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and was blasted apart, dissolving into nothingness. The force of the blow blew the remaining glass out of the window frames, sending it showering into the garden below. Silence slammed back into the room. The curtains settled. The armoire lay still. Alara stood amidst the wreckage, her chest heaving, her skin glowing faintly with the residue of the power she had just channeled. The violet light in her eyes faded slowly, returning to deep green. She lowered her arms, her fingers trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She turned slowly, dread coiling in her stomach heavier than the magic had been. Silas was sitting against the wall, a bruise already darkening on his ribs. He wasn't looking at the broken furniture. He wasn't looking at the shattered window. He was looking at her. His steel-gray eyes were wide, stripped of their usual cynical assurance. He looked at her hands, then her face, trying to reconcile the woman he had just made love to with the force of nature that had just blasted a ghost into oblivion. The logic, the reason, the evidence-based world he had built his entire life upon lay in ruins around him, shattered just as surely as the mirror. "Alara," he whispered, the name sounding foreign on his tongue. He didn't move toward her. He pressed his back harder against the wall, a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like horror crossing his face. What are you?" The question hung in the stagnant air between them, sharper than shattered glass and twice as dangerous. "What are you?" Alara opened her mouth, the taste of ozone and ash coating her tongue. But before she could formulate an answer, before she could beg him not to look at her with that terrifying clinical detachment, the shadows in the corner of the room surged. The entity, wounded by Alara's blast but not defeated, sensed the fracture in their connection. It didn't lunge for the witch this time. It lunged for the skeptic. "Silas!" Alara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and unpolished. The darkness didn't strike him like a fist. It poured into him like freezing oil. Silas gasped, his back arching off the wall as his steel-gray eyes rolled back, the whites flashing starkly against his tanned skin. The temperature in the room plummeted, frosting the jagged shards of the broken mirror. The smell of rot, ancient, wet decay, overwhelmed the scent of crushed lavender. Alara scrambled forward, her velvet skirts tangling around her legs, but a wall of kinetic force slammed her back. She skidded across the dusty floorboards, her palms scraping against the wood. "No," she hissed, her emerald eyes flaring with inner light. "Get out of him!" Inside the prison of his own mind, Silas Thorne was drowning. It wasn't water filling his lungs. It was a cacophony of rage that wasn't his own. Visions flashed behind his eyelids. A jealous lover, a poisoned cup, a woman weeping in this very room a century ago. The entity wanted to use his strength, his body, to finish a vendetta that had long turned to dust. "Give in," the voice whispered, sounding like grinding stones. "She is unnatural. She is the danger. Kill the witch." Silas grit his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching. His hands, weathered and scarred from 30 years on the force, clenched into fists at his sides. He was a man of evidence. He was a man of logic. And the logic presented by this intruder was flawed. Unnatural? Silas thought, fighting the freezing numbness spreading through his limbs. Maybe, but she's the only thing in this room that feels like life. He forced his eyes open. The room was swimming in a gray haze, but he focused on the one point of color, Alara. She was on her knees, hands raised, chanting in a language that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. She wasn't attacking him. She was weaving a net of silver light to contain the darkness leaking from his pores. "Silas!" Her voice was a lifeline. "I can hold it, but I can't banish it without the tether. It's anchored here. You have to find it." The tether. The detective in him latched onto the concept. A physical object. Evidence. Ghosts didn't just linger out of boredom. They were held by trauma attached to matter. The entity roared in his head, trying to blind him, but Silas Thorne had stared down cartel hitmen and serial killers. He pushed the supernatural noise aside, compartmentalizing the horror with a sheer force of will that rivaled Alara's magic. He scanned the room, not with the eyes of a lover or a victim, but with the cold, hard gaze of an investigator. The broken armoire? No. The bed? Too new. The shattered window? Irrelevant. His gaze dropped to the floorboards near the radiator. The wood there was darker, slightly warped, as if stained by something long ago. The air around that specific spot shimmered with heatless distortion. "The floor!" Silas choked out, his voice sounding like gravel. "Under the radiator!" The entity shrieked, seizing control of Silas's right arm, forcing him to reach for the jagged piece of glass on the floor. It intended to cut the threat. Silas himself. "Ignis Sanctus! Liga Alara cried out. A whip of violet light lashed out from her fingers, wrapping around Silas's wrist, jerking his hand away from the glass. She was sweating, her silver-streaked hair plastering to her forehead. "I can't hold him forever, Silas. Break the anchor!" Silas roared, a primal sound of defiance. He used the momentum of Alara's magical restraint to throw his body forward, not toward her, but toward the warped floorboard. He didn't have spells. He didn't have herbs. He had a crowbar he'd left near the tool belt earlier that afternoon. His fingers closed around the cold steel of the tool. The entity hammered at his skull, a migraine of blinding intensity. "You are old," it mocked. "You are weak." "I'm retired," Silas growled, jamming the curved end of the crowbar into the gap between the boards. "I'm not dead." With a heave that strained the heavy leather of his jacket and popped the sinews in his neck, he wrenched the board up. The wood splintered with a scream that echoed the ghost's own. Beneath the floor lay a cavity filled with rat nesting and dust, and resting in the center was a silver locket, black with tarnish, vibrating with malice. "Alara, now!" Silas yelled. He didn't know what she would do, but he knew what he had to do. He didn't touch the cursed object with his skin. He raised the heavy iron crowbar high. At the same moment, Alara threw her hands forward, and a column of pure, blinding white light slammed into Silas, channeling through his body, into his arm, and into the iron. For a split second, he felt it, the rush of the ley lines, the intoxicating, terrifying power she wielded. It was electric, tasting of thunderstorms and wild mint. It flowed through him, and for that second, he wasn't just a man. He was a conduit. He brought the crowbar down. Crunch. The impact was sickeningly solid, The locket shattered. A shockwave blasted outward, blowing the remaining glass from the window frames and knocking Silas onto his back. A wail, thin and hopeless, spiraled up toward the ceiling before dissolving into nothingness. Then, silence. The oppressive weight lifted instantly. The smell of rot evaporated, replaced by the crisp, clean scent of the night air rushing in through the broken window. Silas lay on the floor, his chest heaving, staring up at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. His hand was still gripping the crowbar, so tight his knuckles were white. He was alive. He was sane. A soft rustle of fabric, and then Alara was there. She didn't hover, she collapsed beside him, her energy spent. Her hand trembling reached out to touch his chest, right over his heart. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice was small, stripped of its priestess command. He turned his head. She looked terrified. Not of the ghost, but of him, of his judgment. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into her palm. I should go. I can pack my things tonight. I know this is too much for—" His hand shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was firm, warm, and undeniably human. He pulled her down until her forehead rested against his shoulder. He could smell the sage in her hair, the sweat on her skin, the lingering ozone of her power. It was the most grounding scent he had ever known. "You aren't going anywhere," he rumbled, the vibration of his voice moving through her. "But you saw," she stammered against his jacket. "You asked what I was." "I know what you are," Silas said. He released her wrist and moved his hand to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the thick, silver-streaked raven silk. "You're the woman who just saved my life. You're the storm that cleared the air." He shifted, wincing as his bruised ribs protested, and sat up, bringing her with him. He looked into those emerald eyes, seeing the centuries of knowledge and the very human vulnerability hiding behind them. "I deal in facts, Alara," he said softly. "Fact, I was drowning. Fact, you pulled me out. Fact, I have never felt more alive than I do when I'm with you." A tear slipped down her cheek, tracking through a smudge of dust. "I am a witch, Silas. It isn't a hobby. It is my blood. It is dangerous." "I was a homicide detective in Chicago for 30 years, he countered, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips, bringing back the handsome arrogance she adored. "You think I can't handle dangerous? I've been looking for answers my whole life. Tonight I think I finally found a mystery worth solving." He leaned in, brushing his lips against her temple. "Teach me," he whispered against her skin. "Tell me about the ley lines. Tell me about the herbs. I can handle the wiring and the plumbing of this old house, Alara, but you have to handle the soul of it. And maybe mine too." Alara let out a sob that turned into a laugh, burying her face in his neck. The magic in the room settled, no longer wild and defensive, but warm and golden, wrapping around them like a quilt. 3 years later, the early autumn sun filtered through the high windows of the Hawthorne Manor Library, illuminating dust motes that danced not with ghosts, but with the simple, lazy drift of a Sunday afternoon. The air smelled of beeswax polish, fresh-baked rosemary bread, and the distinct, earthy tang of drying mugwort. The B&B was fully booked for the Harvest Festival. Guests were currently in the garden, marveling at the sheer size of the pumpkins and the unusual vibrancy of the late-blooming roses. Silas walked into the library, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His hair was fully silver now, cut close and neat, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, not from squinting at crime scenes, but from smiling. He wore a heavy flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that were still corded with muscle. "Boiler's fixed," he announced, tossing the rag onto a chair. "Though I still think that thing runs on sheer spite rather than gas." Alara looked up from the heavy, leather-bound grimoire on the desk. At 54, she was more breathtaking than she had been at 51. There was a serenity to her now, a power that didn't need to flare to be felt. She wore a dress of deep plum wool that hugged her curves, a silver pendant resting in the hollow of her throat. "It runs on the house's mood, Silas," she teased, closing the book with a soft thud. "And the house is temperamental when you neglect it to go fishing." "I went fishing to catch dinner," he defended, walking around the desk to stand behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs digging into the tension at the base of her neck. "And I seem to recall you enjoying the trout." Alara leaned back into his touch, humming in appreciation. "I did. You have your uses, detective." "And you have yours, priestess," he murmured, bending down to kiss the sensitive spot behind her ear. He looked at the open ledger on the desk next to her spellbook. The numbers were balanced perfectly. That was their dance. He kept the roof from leaking and the taxes paid. She kept the spirits quiet and the guests enchanted. He was the anchor. She was the sail. "The Connolly sisters are checking in at 3, Silas noted, his voice dropping to that low register that still made Alara's breath hitch. They asked if the handsome owner would be available to carry their bags. Alara turned in her chair, capturing his face in her hands. Her rings, silver and amethyst, felt cool against his warm skin. "Tell them the handsome owner is spoken for. He belongs to the witch in the tower." Silas grinned, the expression making his gray eyes sparkle. "Is that a spell?" "A binding," she corrected softly, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of coffee and promise. "Eternal." He kissed her back, deep and slow, pouring 3 years of peace, 3 years of healing, and 3 years of love into the contact. When they pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Good," he whispered. "I never did like broken contracts." Outside, the wind chimed through the hawthorn trees, singing a song of protection, while inside, the fire in the hearth flared bright and steady, warmed by a magic that had nothing to do with spells and everything to do with the man holding the witch in his arms.